All right, guys. So here's the deal. This is going to be our new unit on physical and chemical properties. So we're talking about matter a little bit more detail than normal. Um, I'm waiting on the words here, but they're not here. So I'm going to click them up. Oh, there we go. Properties of matter. And so we're describing matter, not just what it is. We had a unit on that a long time ago in first quarter, and this is now the properties of matter. What does it look like? How does it act? Okay. So the first thing you're going to do in your notes is what is a property? That's what we're looking at. What does that mean? We say what a property of matter is. In science, a property means a characteristic or trait that you can use to describe matter by observation, measurement, or a combination of those. So when we say observe, it means that you're going to use your senses. You're going to see it, hear it, taste it, smell it, or touch it. Something is going to happen. And so matter has properties that we observe or we measure. So it might be its mass or its density or its height or its hardness. These are all things that we measure matter in. So first, before we start, we're going to ask kind of a silly question. I say silly, it's not, but it's getting you in this idea of when we look at matter, how do we start to look at these properties? So how would you describe yourself so that someone else could identify you? So I guess what we're really asking is, what are your properties? So in your notes document, you can write as many physical descriptions of yourself as you can. You don't need to put your name on the paper, obviously. I know it's yours because it's not even paper, it's online. But let's go ahead and do that. You can take some time, pause the video, and just think, if I were to look at a mirror, how could I observe, how could I measure me? It's a good way to look at it. Okay. So you might have thought of, like, you have your height, you have color, which you hair color, eye color, you have your mass, you have maybe the width of your shoulders or the height of your waist. There's all kinds of things you could measure, right? And also things that you can see. So those are all things that we do with matter when we start to look at properties. First thing we're going to look at is physical properties. So a property of matter that can be observed or measured without changing the identity of the matter. So really, when we talk about properties, this is just the definition of a property, really, property of matter. But there's a key phrase of without changing the identity of the matter. So it's not something new. It's still made of the same atoms, the same compounds that it already was made out of. And so there's not a change here in matter from one object to another, from one thing to another, right? And so physical properties identify matter. So we can make, there's matter that relates based on their physical properties. And so identity comes with properties. And then you use your five senses typically to describe them. So you're describing what you see, what you hear, you taste, smell, or touch. All right. And here are some examples of physical properties. Not only these 3 or 6 that have been here, the volume, which we can measure, right? The melting point, which we can measure. We can heat something until it melts, so we know, oh, hey, that's when it melts. The boiling point, which we can also measure. Magnetism, which we can observe, right? We can use magnetic devices, or iron, which is a metal that magnets attach to. We can observe the shape of matter and then what it's made out of, right? So just simply what is it made out of, chemically or whatever. We can also measure the density, which is the mass divided by the volume of an object, how dense something is, how much mass is in a certain amount of space. The malleability, that's a big word. Malleable means its ability to be bent. And so metals actually are very malleable, which is a property of metals. Some of you guys did metals in your element project, and you found out that it was a malleable element. So malleability, ductility, which is similar to malleability with metal, but it can be put into a wire. So malleability is the ability to be bent into a shape, kind of like metal, we bend into the shape for cars. Or ductility, the ability to be uh, pulled out into wire or into strands so that we like have copper wiring to do electricity in our homes, in our school, or even like the metal fibers in our internet cables or cable TV. Solubility, which is the ability to dissolve in water. So the solubility, does it dissolve in water? What state of matter is it? Is it a solid, liquid, or a gas? Thermal conductivity, which is a big word, but basically the ability to conduct heat or to transfer heat. So metals are really good thermal conductors. Some matters not. It just depends. So that's a property we can observe, right? And then the color, which is really simple. And then also weight, which is probably more like mass is what we're talking about, because weight is a force. And mass is really what we're looking at when we say weight. So these are all things that we can measure or observe. And when they're physical properties, because we can take something and not change it, we could do all these things. We can say, how dense is it? Can I bend it? No. Is it bendable? It's still metal, but is it bendable? No. Can I put it into a wire? No. Does it dissolve in water? No. Is it a state of matter? What state of matter is it currently in? Is it conductive? I can put it on the oven. Does it get hot? What color is it? What is the weight? What is the volume? How big? How much space does it take up? When does it melt? When does it boil? Is it magnetic? What shape is this in? Is it a sphere? Is it a cube? Is it in no shape? And then what is it made out of? I could really test that if I really needed to. I could determine what is it made out of. So these are all physical properties, things that we observe or measure without changing the object, right? And then we have chemical properties. The chemical property is a property. So we go back to the definition of a property. It describes a substance based on, in this case, the ability to change. So can this object change given a certain situation? Will it change into a new substance? So not all matter is going to change very well. You have to physically break it down, or there's no chemical changes that happen. So the only way to change it is to physically change it. But there's a lot of matter in the universe that will change chemically, and that's comes from chemical properties. So we have combustibility, which is a property of like gasoline or alcohol or certain compounds that will catch fire, right? Or they're combustible. So that means when oxygen is present in energy, they can burst into flames, right? Or they can be used for energy. They release a lot of energy. They're combustible. They're flammable, which is similar. Flammable means that it can catch fire. Combustible means that it can start fire. Then we have reactivity to pH, which is really pH means percent of hydrogen, but we really talk about pH when we talk about acids and bases, and then oxidation, which is all chemistry words really for you guys, but it's kind of like vinegar and baking soda. If you've ever put vinegar with baking soda, that's an example of reactivity to pH. You have a base and an acid, you put them together, and there is a reaction. And from that reaction, you get a few things that are a result of that. You actually get salt water of some kind, and then CO2, like a gas that bubbles or forms. There are also a lot more chemical properties, not just those, that are a little less specific and kind of hard to identify. So one is reactivity to water. There are some elements, you guys know, because you did some research, that are super reactive to water, and that would be a chemical property, reactivity. There are some that are more reactive with other compounds, and so that would be reactivity. to another compound, depending on what it is. It may not be acids and bases only. There are other compounds that do react. And so the ability for it to react is a chemical property. And then the ability to combine with another element. And so when we talk about reactivity, that kind of means reaction, which is kind of where we're going in chemistry. So these are things that the ability or the potential to have these things happen, to absorb or generate energy. And so we call those endothermic or exothermic reactions. And we'll get more into that before we finish 7th grade science. But these are, when we see the ability to, these are possibilities. And so chemical properties are harder to observe. They're not the same as like a physical property that I can just see. They're more like potential things that can happen. And so they can be observed with your senses. So usually you can see these with your senses just like anything else. There's no other way to observe. So, but they are not as easy to observe as physical properties, meaning that chemical properties are often hidden properties in substances. And so like, let's say you had a clear liquid, but you didn't know what it was. Sometimes there could be a smell or some things like that that give away what it is, so you know some of the chemical properties. But other times you're not really sure. And so there are things you can do to test that. And you just want to make sure when you are testing for chemical properties that you're doing it safely. And that's something that's important in science and in life, really. And then chemical properties cannot be seen until a chemical change has happened. And so when we talk about chemical properties, almost always there's a chemical change, because that's what they are, the ability for change to take place. And so oftentimes there are things that are present that tell us that something has that ability to change because we made that observation when a chemical change has happened. So we kind of like know what gasoline smells like. And that smell or a smell similar to it can tell us that there's a chemical property of combustibility with a certain liquid. It may not be the same fuel or the same thing as gasoline or alcohol. It could be lots of different components, but there's a smell to that. You know, there's properties that give away how things are going to interact. And so those are the things that we're focusing on. And this is all part of our first, our new unit, though. We're going to focus on the physical and chemical properties, and we get to changes before the semester ends. That's great. But right now, this is what we're focusing on. Hopefully, you've had time. If you need to, you can go back and use this video and pause the screen so that you can fill out your notes. You need to complete those. And then make sure that you have those available so that you can use them to practice answering questions and applying the principles of chemical and physical properties to our activities the rest of the week. Good job, guys.